The first known human settlements on modern-day Russian soil date back to the Stone Age, specifically the Lower Paleolithic era about 2 million years ago. We believe members of the extinct species Homo erectus migrated from Western Asia to the region north of the Caucasus Mountain Range. The extinct Homo erectus were a species of archaic humans. Neanderthals and Madonna could also be considered archaic humans. Speaking of Neanderthals, let's fast forward a bit to the formation of the Russian identity. During the 9th century, Scandinavian Norsemen, commonly referred to as Vikings, began to settle in Eastern Europe along the Dnieper River Valley. By the 10th century, the native Slavic population had blended with their Christian Scandinavian rulers to create the Slavic variant of the Eastern Orthodox religion. This fusion of cultures also included the absorption of Greek Christian influences resulting from multiple raids on Constantinople. Subsequently, the decision by the Kievan Rus to adopt Christianity as the state's religion in 988 AD was, according to one Kievan Rus official, quote, "not at all influenced by our simping over the Byzantine Empire." In all seriousness, this historical period would encompass the blending of Byzantine, Scandinavian, and Slavic cultures, which would define Russian culture throughout the next millennium. Incessant infighting between members of the princely family would weaken the state.
You know how I feel. Why would you say that? Like, you put me in such an uncomfortable situation.
Ultimately, the Kievan Rus would meet the same fate as all Sims: destruction at the hands of the ultimate Chad. Okay, it was Genghis's grandson, Badu, since good old Genghis had died about 10 years earlier in 1227. In only 3 years, the Mongol invasions had steamrolled over the Kievan Rus, Poland, Hungary, and portions of the Balkans. But that is a story for another day. With their state and sense of cohesion destroyed, the people of the now defunct Kievan Rus would flee to Poland, Lithuania, and smaller principalities in the north not yet fully under Mongol control. The destruction of their mercantile economy, the severing of communications between Europe in the east and the Byzantines in the west, left the Orthodox Church as the final bastion of Russian culture, preserving Russian literature, language, and traditions. Throughout the Mongol occupation, Moscow would establish itself as a serious cultural and political force, championing the unification of Russian territories. As the 15th century was ending, so too would the Mongols' control over the region. Several principalities surrounding Moscow would unite under Ivan the Great and would take back full sovereignty from the Mongols under the Grand Duchy of Moscow. Born in Moscow in 1440, Ivan Vasilievich III, otherwise known as Ivan the Great, became the Grand Prince of Moscow and all of Russia in 1462. Ivan would begin his reign at the very responsible age of 22 years old, and ruled until his death in 1505. If you're ever at a party and need an interesting fact, I've got just the thing for you. Unprompted, Ivan would begin using the title of Tsar in his foreign correspondence with other monarchs, but until the Habsburgs just decided to throw the guy a bone and eventually recognized the title. However, at home, Ivan was content with his title of Grand Prince. What a chill guy. What I can't help you with is getting invited to a party. Like his Kievan Rus predecessors before him, Ivan looked longingly towards the Byzantine Empire. However, unlike his Kievan Rus predecessors, Ivan would refuse to simp and decided to marry Princess Sophia
Palaiologina
of Byzantium, fulfilling every Kievan Rus official's wet Byzantine dreams. Returning to reality, this marriage would unite the Byzantine and Russian royal families, promoting Ivan to declare Moscow as the Third Rome and making Russia's coat of arms the double-headed eagle. Just a personal aside here, this is, I think, more proof that no matter the century, men are always going to be thinking about Rome. The people of the Grand Duchy of Moscow would recognize just how based Grand Prince Ivan was, and decided to bestow their leader with the title of Great, for the first time in Russian history. The title is well deserved in my opinion, for Ivan incorporated Byzantine practices into Russian courts and culture, expanded Russian territory, but most importantly, he united the Moscow principalities in overthrowing the terrible Mongol invaders. Speaking of terrible, Ivan Vasilievich IV, often referred to as Ivan the Terrible, became the Grand Prince in 1533 and the first crowned Tsar of Russia in 1547, ruling until his death in 1584. Like most bad guy origin stories, Ivan's childhood and adolescence was consumed by tragedy and despair. At only 3 years old, Ivan's father forgot to renew his subscription to life and subsequently died. Ivan's mother would later be poisoned when he was 8, which, unfortunately, violated life's subscriber agreement. Not only did Ivan not become Batman after losing both of his parents, he also did not have an affectionate butler to help raise him. Quite the opposite, in fact. Ivan's caretakers were reportedly cruel and sadistic, denying poor Ivan any affection, clothing, and even food at times. Regardless, Ivan would mature into a stable and morally conscious young man. Okay, no. Taking after his caretakers, Ivan would develop into a cruel and sadistic young man, engaging in activities from whipping people, torturing animals, and engaging in... What? Another quick sidebar here. I 100% believe Ivan would have been big into the goth scene today.
Got your ass.
Ivan would marry his first wife, Anastasia Romanova, in 1547, who could seemingly hold him down. And yes, that is the same family that would later rule Russia. No sarcasm here. With the state of our current education system, good on you for noticing that. And if you didn't, well, at least you have something in common with Ivan. Your family doesn't love you.
Emotional damage.
Tragically, Anastasia would die young at the age of 30. The cause of her death is still debated. However, Ivan believed that she was poisoned as his mother was. Without Anastasia, Ivan would become as unhinged as ever, living in a state of constant rage, akin to most COD players today. But don't feel too bad for Ivan. He would go on to have 6 more wives, of which 3 were poisoned, 2 were sent to a nunnery, and 1 that drowned. Ivan was down so bad that he even pursued Elizabeth I of England, aka the Virgin Queen, because that sounds like a great idea. After predictably being rejected, Ivan would go on to describe Elizabeth I as, and this is a real quote, a common wench in his writings. Karma would catch up to Ivan, however, when he suffered a mysterious illness in 1564 that resulted in nearly all of his hair falling out and solidifying his already growing paranoia. Ivan would see enemies everywhere, focusing his fury on the Russian people, a tried and true Russian tradition if I've ever seen one. Specifically, the the boyars, who were Russian aristocrats and government leaders who advised the Tsar. They were blamed for all of Ivan's hardships, from torturing him during childhood, poisoning his mother and wife, to challenging his God-given authority. As punishment, he would murder an estimated 10,000 of them, while sending others to far-flung Russian frontiers during a reign of terror lasting the better part of a decade. The killings would typically occur in churches, and were prosecuted by men dressed in dark clothing impersonating monks. These blasphemous killers were known as the
Oprichniki
and were feared throughout all of Russia. Ivan's terror would not only be domestic, however. He was going to take his terror on tour. Initially, Ivan's tour of terror went about as well as his childhood and romantic life, that being pretty bad. Ivan would kick off his terror tour in 1545 at only 15 years old, leading an expedition to show his support for the pro-Russian factions that had been repeatedly raided by the Kazan Khanate. The Kazan Khanate was a Tatar state that formed as a successor of the Golden Horde. Before it was conquered by Tsarist Russia, the Khanate had controlled the region just west of Muscovy. Russia would launch 2 unsuccessful campaigns before defeating the Khanate in 1552, ensuring the state's safety from any further raids. Beyond securing Russia's existing territory, the conquest of the Khanate also opened the door for Russia to expand into the vast wilderness of Siberia, which to this day holds a significant amount of natural resources. Additionally, expansion into this sparsely populated area would provide a buffer between Russia and any future adversaries to their east. Creating buffer states between themselves and perceived enemies would continue to be an important pillar of Russia's security apparatus moving forward. Unfortunately for Ivan, he would not live to see even the initial stages of Russia's conquest of Siberia. Redirecting our attention to the west, Ivan would embark upon a doomed campaign to seize Baltic ports from Livonia to use for trade with Europe. However, Livonia's ally Lithuania and their ally Poland would resist the Russian invasion, with support coming from IKEA land later in the war. Ivan would receive several peace proposals from his enemies, but would swiftly reject every proposal against the advice of his advisors. And over the course of 24 bloody years of fighting, Russia would lose most of its gains and even be pushed back into their own territory. With the writing on the wall, Russia would sue for peace in 1582 with help from the clergy, resulting in the Truce of Jam-Sapolsky between Russia and the now united Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Although the Truce of Polsa with Sweden would not be agreed upon until 1583, Ivan and Russia would be humiliated, having to return captured Polish-Lithuanian and Swedish territory. However, it wasn't all bad news on the war front for Ivan. To the south, the Ottoman Empire under Sultan Selim would attempt to conquer the Caucasus with the vision of building a canal between the Volga and Don rivers. Russia would repel the Ottoman forces and secure the Volga once again. However, things were far from secure in the south. In fact, arguably Ivan's worst defeat would come roaring out of the south and would not stop until reaching Moscow. With most of their troops committed to the Livonian front in the north, Devlet-Giray, ruler of the Crimean Khanate, would attack Russia as revenge for Ivan's raids following the conquest of Kazan and Astrakhan. Outnumbering Russian forces by as much as 6-1, an army of Crimean Tatars, Ottoman troops, and Nogai hordes would overwhelm the meager Russian garrison near the Crimean border. With resistance far weaker than expected, Giray decided to march the army north to sack Moscow.
Run.
With reportedly everything but the Kremlin burning to the ground. As the Livonian War concluded, so too would our beloved Ivan's story. With Ivan's death in 1584, his only surviving son, Fyodor, would become the Tsar of Russia, ruling for 13 years until his death. Despite his best efforts, Fyodor would not sire any children to continue the Rurik family line. This would mark the beginning of the very prosperous and joyous time in Russia called the Time of Troubles.